Yeah, so I'm going to talk about Fairgraph, which is a tool which builds on top of the things we've seen earlier in this session. So it builds on openMINDS, it builds on the knowledge graph, and the knowledge graph query API, for example, which Oliver just showed. Specifically, so we take the openMINDS schemas and we use the openMINDS generator tool, which can generate lots of different ways of representing the schemas, and one of those is as Python classes, and so we use the openMINDS generator to generate part of the Fairgraph library with the openMINDS schemas. In contrast to what Stefan showed, Fairgraph only has the most recent version of the schemas. We don't have all the previous versions. That could be changed in future. That's something we have to discuss. Yeah, so Fairgraph also talks to the knowledge graph through this library from Oliver's team called KG Core Python. And for the time being, it's also compatible with the current version, presumably the old version of the knowledge graph, version 2, through a couple of other libraries from Oliver's team. And so at the moment, this is useful for curators, for example, who can use this kind of double capability to migrate data from version 2 to version 3. But very soon, in the next few months, knowledge graph migration will be complete. Knowledge graph version 2 will be switched off, and so these parts will be removed from Fairgraph. So essentially, it's a combination of openMINDS and knowledge graph access. Currently, to install it, you have to install the KG Core Python library directly from GitHub. I think soon it will be on PyPI. So it'll be much simpler. Just pip install KG Core Python and then pip install Fairgraph. So how this looks like in practice is, so from Fairgraph.client version 3 here, we import our knowledge graph client object. We initialize it, telling it which knowledge graph API we wish to use. So by default, and here I'm using the pre-production version rather than the production server. And I would strongly recommend that, at least for experimentation, if you want to play with Fairgraph, that you always try to use the PPD server, just to avoid kind of filling up the production server with lots of experiments and tests. If you actually want, of course, to access the production data, then of course you can replace this with just core.kg.ebrains.eu. Now, you perhaps saw in Yuba's presentation that openMINDS defines which fields are required and which fields are not. And Fairgraph includes these restrictions on required and optional fields. In some cases, in particular, because this migration is ongoing, not all of the data in the knowledge graph necessarily meets these requirements on which fields are obligatory. And so you probably, for the time being, want to set this strict mode to false, and then it will tell you if some required fields are missing, but it won't cause an exception. If this is true by default, it will just complain and create an exception if there are missing fields. So once you have this, I'm missing an import here. So there should be a from fairgraph.openminds.core import dataset version. And so each schema in openMINDS is turned into a Python class. And we can use this Python class as a way to access the data of that type of that schema in the knowledge graph. And so here, for example, we can use dataset version.list. We pass it the client so it can talk to the knowledge graph. And here we're filtering. We want only those data sets which have the phrase patch clamp in the dataset name. And this, just in passing, we add this in progress scope because the migration is happening. So by default, this shows released data. Because the migration is in process, not everything is released yet in the new knowledge graph. And so this won't work unless you have the right permissions to see this in progress data. But once it's all released, then you can just miss this part off and it will show you only the released data sets. And so then we can iterate through our dataset objects and show, for example, the dataset name. And so these are the 5 datasets which have patch clamp in their names. So there are a few key concepts here. One is the scope. So there are 2 principal scopes in the knowledge graph. One is released and one is in progress. So released means the metadata have been curated and they will appear in the public knowledge graph search with no authentication required. In progress means the metadata are either uncurated or just the curation is incomplete. And these metadata are access controlled. And so by default, anyone can use Fairgraph to access released data, but unless you are a curator or have other permissions, you won't be able to access the in progress metadata unless you create it yourself. And I'll come to that a little bit later on. The second concept to understand is spaces. So the knowledge graph is divided into different spaces, which are used for access control and just to give more structure to the knowledge graph. So there are a number of public spaces. Here, only curators can write to these spaces. Anyone can read from these spaces if it's released metadata. But normal users can't write to these data. And there are various public spaces like Atlas, obviously for spatial locations in the brain, common for people, organizations, funding. The space called dataset has metadata about datasets, and so on. I think the one exception to the public access rule is this restricted space, which contains GDPR sensitive metadata like individual email addresses or physical addresses. So as well as these public spaces, there are also private spaces, which are really intended for this in progress metadata. So this is essentially, again, answering for a second time Dennis's question. So if you want to write data to the knowledge graph, you can do it in private spaces. So everyone gets a MySpace, just that's the string you have to use. And so each individual with an EBRAINS account has read and write access to this space. In addition, you can request from the knowledge graph team the creation of a collab space. And then for any existing collab that you have, a space is created which uses the same access control as that collab. So if you add someone to your collab with editor permissions, they will have write access to this collab space in the knowledge graph. So to come back again to this openMINDS mapping, as I said, each schema maps to a Python class. So here, this HTML documentation, which you can find online, tells you for the person object. So given name is required, it's in bold, and this is the description of it, and this is the type, it's a string. Affiliation is not required, and this is an embedded object type affiliation. So this map directly is used to generate the Python classes. So we can see again that here given name is required. Affiliation is, where is it? Affiliation here is not required. And the Python documentation of these fields matches what you see in the online documentation. Now, to follow links in the graph, then yeah. So yeah, so to follow links in the graph. So here what I've done is I'm searching now with software version, and we want to find the representation of Nest version 2.20 in there. And so we do software version.list, alias is Nest, version identifier is v2.20.0. And we expect there's only one, so we take the first element of the list. Now, if we show the content of this object, we can see some of these fields are straightforward. So the ID is just a URL, an IRI. Many of these actually are links in the graph. And so for each of these links, we see this KG proxy object, which contains just the type and then the URI. If we want to see what exists at that link, then we can use the resolve method. And so if we take nest.220.licenses, that's a KG proxy object, which we can then resolve. And then we get the actual object itself from the knowledge graph, and we can see the contents of that particular object. There are various convenience methods as well. So person.me uses the information from your token, which you gave to the client, to tell you, which person is currently logged in, which token you're using. Similarly, there are things like dataset download, which let you download an entire dataset from the knowledge graph to your local directory. So if you want to save metadata to the knowledge graph, again, this is where you have to use these private spaces. And so here I'm importing from Fairgraph, openminds.core, person, organization, affiliation. I can build this up. So MGM. So this is Stan Laurel, famous silent era movie actor, along with Oliver Hardy. So I want to have a database about movie actors, which is not what the Fairgraph, the knowledge graph is for, but you could use it for that. So MGM is the studio he worked for in the second half of his career, and he started to work there in 1942. So the affiliation is to MGM with his start time. So Stan Laurel has this affiliation, and now we can save it to the knowledge graph. So author.save using our client, and importantly, space is now my space. So I'm saving this to my own personal space in the knowledge graph. Only I can access it. If I use a collab space, then only people who have access to the same collab can access it. But importantly, this is, following again Dennis's question, this is a nice way to let you put your data already into the knowledge graph, and potentially simplifies the pipeline to then curating this and having this publicly released. So I think that particular pipeline hasn't been well worked out in the curation team yet. We're working on it, but obviously it should be quicker and faster to publish your data if it's already in an appropriate structure in the knowledge graph. Future plans, of course, we'll remove access to version 2, more helper methods, an option to automatically follow these links. So rather than having to resolve each link separately, we'll let you resolve them automatically, and then simplify the API in various ways. So Fairgraph is usable now, it's being used in many tools, but it is beta software. And so if you find bugs, please let us know. And if you'd like help and support, please contact eBrains support in the usual way. I'd like to thank the people from who have worked directly on Fairgraph, as well as the people behind Knowledge Graph and openMINDS.